everybody, and welcome to today's episode of Echo Live, brought to you by Denso and the Michigan Space Grant Consortium. And I am, of course, coming to you today from the Michigan Science Center's Echo Distance Learning Studio. The topic of today's episode is winter is coming, because it is. The weather is finally cooling down here in Detroit, Michigan, and perhaps it is as well where you are. So if you are tuning in live, you can tell me, first off, does it start to feel like winter outside to you? Now, it's a bit rainy, but I know in the coming weeks, the temperatures are going to start getting colder and colder and colder as we get closer to wintertime. Now, I personally love wintertime. I think it's great to do all sorts of fun activities outside in the snow. You may feel differently about winter, but humans are really well adapted to survive winter temperatures. However, I want to spend a little bit of time today talking about plants. How do plants prepare for winter? Now, plants like you or I can't just go out, realize it's pretty cold outside and run back in and grab their jacket, right? Plants have to be adapted to survive colder temperatures. So what do I mean by adapted? Well, living things have adaptations, things that make them suited to survive in their environment and to continue having offspring who are designed to survive in their environment. Since we're talking about plants today, we'll focus on some different types of plant adaptations. Now, not just for wintertime, but plants can have all sorts of adaptations that make them well suited for where they grow. The first image that we see here on the slide is an adaptation called the lotus leaf effect. The lotus leaf effect is pretty interesting. Certain types of plants actually repel water, which sounds funny because plants definitely need water, just like you and I need water to stay alive. But plants can live in environments where sometimes there's too much water, that they couldn't possibly drink it all or use it for their metabolic processes. And so plants with the lotus leaf effect can actually repel water to keep themselves safe in an environment where maybe it's a little bit too wet. Some common examples of the lotus leaf effect are it's seen in lily pads, like we see here in the image on screen, but it's also found in one of my least favorite vegetables of all time. And you can tell me whether you are a fan or not of kale. Now, kale is full of nutrients and vitamins. We love kale. Our parents tell us to eat the kale, so eat the kale. But kale is also another one of those plants that has adapted to have this lotus leaf effect. So if I drop some water here on my kale, watch what happens. My water just beads up and rolls away. Now, instead of pooling up and puddling, that water is almost repelling right off of our plant. And this works on both the front and the back side of our kale leaf here. This helps to keep these leaves clean. It helps to keep them dry. It helps to protect them from disease and rot in an environment where maybe they were to encounter more water than they're able to use, like we said, for their metabolic processes. But the lotus leaf effect is not the only way that plants can be adapted. You might have seen on my screen that I also have an image of a Venus flytrap. Now, a Venus flytrap does exactly what its name sounds like. Instead of relying only on photosynthesis to feed these plants, they are also carnivorous plants. These plants will eat animals, which sounds kind of funny because normally animals eat plants, but in this case, a plant has adapted to eat animals. So when a fly lands in one of these Venus flytraps, the flytrap will close and it will digest that fly or other animal for energy. Another way that plants can be adapted is by becoming poisonous. So poisonous plants sometimes will form bright colors like this as a warning that if you were to ingest one of these plants, that it might make you pretty sick. So fair warning to all, right? Plants can have all sorts of adaptations to protect themselves from not just the environment, but also from people from people and animals that might like to eat them. So always be careful. If you choose to eat a plant that you find outside, make sure you know what it is, where it was grown, and what has touched that plant, just to be safe. So plants can adapt, right? They can adapt to survive, but they can also adapt to survive various types of extreme or hazardous weather. Now, hazardous weather can be, like we said, hazardous. It can be very dangerous to different types of plants. Some examples of hazardous weather that you see up here on the slide are things like tornadoes. So a tornado came through and it actually ripped this tree out of the ground, or something like a very heavy windstorm. We can also have things like floods or too much water or rainfall in an area can be pretty hazardous to plants. I know we've gotten a lot more rain than we expected to this year here in Michigan, and that can be not such a good thing for certain types of plants that aren't adapted for it. And also we could have the opposite problem, right? So instead of having too much rain or too much water, we could have no water at all. That's what we call a drought. But the last type of hazardous weather that I want to talk about has to do with the topic of today's episode, which is extreme cold. Now, we are getting ready for winter, right? So we'll talk a little bit about how we are preparing plants that are crops to survive winter, but I want to show you what might happen if these plants weren't protected. So I have some really cold stuff here inside my studio today to show you. First up, I have a container full of one of our favorite materials, just a little bit of dry ice. And before the program, I've just taken one of my flowers here, and I've just placed it down inside. Now, it may not look like anything bad has happened to my flower. It looks pretty nice. I tried putting a little bit of food coloring in this flower pot earlier this week just to turn them yellow, and you can see that worked a little bit. But my flower looks totally fine. However, dry ice is really cold stuff. So if Michigan were to experience cold weather too early, perhaps at a time where farmers are still trying to grow their crops before they're ready to be harvested or eaten, look what might happen. And I'm going to move my tray over here just to keep our mess a little bit more contained. But take a look at what happens to my flower. It falls right apart. It becomes so brittle that it can't stand these types of extended cold temperatures. So flowers like the ones I have here are definitely not well adapted to survive in extreme cold. Now, thankfully, the weather outside doesn't get nearly as cold as the environment that I just showed you with our dry ice, but it's still a good demonstration of what would happen when plants get cold unexpectedly. The water inside those plants might freeze, may no longer be able to move around the plant to be able to power up the various metabolic processes inside for it to grow and to produce pollen or fruits or vegetables or whatever the case might be. But that can be very, very dangerous to plants. So let's try this again with something that's even colder, just for fun. Now inside our beaker, I have some liquid nitrogen, negative 321 degrees Fahrenheit. This stuff is super, super cold. And this time, if I take my flower out, again, it looks totally fine, but take a look. You might even be able to hear that kind of shattering noise. But our flowers are not doing so hot, literally, when we get them this cold. So we said this is about adaptations, right? Our flowers and some of our crops can't necessarily adapt to survive cold temperatures. They're just not designed for it. So we, as the humans who are growing them, sometimes have to engineer solutions to help these plants to protect them from the cold. Because otherwise, oh no, no flowers coming to harvest. So let's talk about some ways that people have done this. On the slide, I just have a couple of my favorite examples of ways that people have engineered solutions to protect their plants from a flash freeze or from the cold weather that's coming up. So there are really simple ways that you can do this as well. So when you are thinking about your plants that you may be growing either inside your house or outside the house, you can design ways on your own to keep them safe. So in our first picture, you can see that simple materials or recycled materials like water bottles can actually be cut and placed over your crops as they grow. This is especially helpful when they're young because it helps to keep moisture inside, helps to keep those plants protected from predators while they're still growing, but there's still a hole in the top to allow in air and moisture so these plants can continue growing. But that layer of plastic around it will also help to insulate it, to create a barrier between that plant and the environment around it. So that can be one way to protect your plants from the cold. The example in the middle is by far my favorite. Maybe you've seen these in your neighborhood, or maybe you've seen these at businesses as winter starts to get closer. But when trees and shrubs are young, sometimes they are just also not adapted to survive in a winter environment. So you can actually buy them winter jackets of their own. So at the beginning of the program, I said one of the simplest ways that we protect ourselves from cold weather is by just putting on your jacket. And you can actually buy one for your plant so it can wear a jacket all winter long as well. And they make all sorts of cute, fun ones that are holiday themed that you can buy for your shrubs to keep them protected from the elements too. The last example is probably the most simple. Just throwing something like a plastic tarp does exactly what our water bottle does. It helps to keep out that cold temperature. It keeps the warm air on the inside. So warm air can also be, or the air stays warm because of the temperature of the dirt, and it helps to keep the cold on the outside. exactly where it should be, on the outside. So if you have plants outside that you are worried about as winter starts to get closer, just want you to keep in mind that this is the time where you decide to either bring them in your house and share the warmth with them for the winter months, or start thinking about engineering some of these solutions of your own. Now, we'll be continuing to talk about winter coming up. We've got a lot more really cold science activities and a little bit more work to do talking about adaptations. So we'll have another talk about animal adaptations coming up too, and about how animals actually are adapted to survive winter environments as well. So with that, thanks everyone so much for joining this week of Echo